Welcome. Thank you everyone for joining us for the webinar, Understanding Stormwater Review and Design under the Inland Flood Protection Rule. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us to learn more about New Jersey's changing stormwater management rules. Just some housekeeping before we get started. This webinar is being recorded and the recording link will be shared out via email with everyone who is registered. To avoid any background noise, please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar. And please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions throughout. Our speakers will either answer you in the chat or we will address your question during the last few minutes of the webinar. We'll also have an optional extended 30-minute Q&A from 1 to 1:30 if you would like to stick around for that. That portion will also be recorded if you're not able to stay. If you are an engineer seeking continuing education credits, a link to a form will be provided in the chat periodically. The New Jersey Builders Association, NJDEP, will distribute certificates of attendance via email. This form must be completed to receive that email. New Jersey Future is one of your webinar hosts today, and the New Jersey Builders Association is a co-sponsor of this event, so thank you to their team for the support in organizing and promoting both this webinar. So here's our agenda for today. First, we're going to cover key changes to New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, NJDEP stormwater rules. Then we're going to hear about the Developer's Green Infrastructure Guide, which is a resource for developers and other design professionals. The majority of today is going to be spent covering strategies for designing green infrastructure under the Inland Flood Protection Rule. And we will have an optional extended Q&A from 1 to 1:30 if you're able to stick around for that. That will be recorded if you're only able to stay for the first hour of content. Here is who you'll be hearing from today. My name is Lindsey Sigmund. I'm a program manager with New Jersey Future. I work on stormwater policy and I oversee our mainstreaming green infrastructure program. Then you'll hear from Michael Sheehan from DEP, Jeromie Lange from Active Acquisitions, Ed Confair from AKRF, and last but not least, George Vallone from Hoboken Brownstone Company. I do ask that each speaker introduce themselves before they dive into their portion of the webinar. And thank you to all of our speakers who took the time to put together the resources that we're going to be sharing with you all today and for providing their expertise. So that's us. Now we want to hear where you all are coming from. We do have a quick poll that should pop up on your screen right now. We want to know, what is your primary role that brings you here today? Are you an engineer, a planner, an attorney, developer? We'll leave this up for another 20 seconds or so. If it doesn't pop up for you, it might be hidden behind your main Zoom window. And if for some reason you do not see the poll, feel free to introduce yourself and your profession in the chat. Do see some responses coming in. Not surprised that we have a lot of engineers on the call today, some planners, developers, a few landscape architects, environmental commissioners, which is great. All right, we'll leave this up for another few seconds. I see about like 83% of our participants have already answered the poll. All right, we've tapered off a little bit, so now's your chance. Please answer the poll. All right, I think we can end the poll. All right. Thank you all. Like I shared at the beginning, feel free to send questions through the chat throughout. Our speakers will either answer live in the chat or we'll address them during the last couple minutes of the webinar or through our extended Q&A from 1 to 1:30 to get you thinking. What's the tough question about green infrastructure or the Inland Flood Protection Rule that you wish someone would ask? Again, you can ask questions all throughout the webinar today. For those of you who are not familiar with New Jersey Future, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes sensible and equitable growth, redevelopment, and infrastructure investments to foster healthy and safe and resilient communities, protect natural lands and waterways, increase transportation choices, provide access to safe and affordable neighborhoods while supporting a strong economy for everyone. And we accomplish this through original research, innovative policy development, coalition building, advocacy, and hands-on technical assistance. I oversee New Jersey Future's mainstreaming green infrastructure program, or MGI. MGI is a program aimed at moving green stormwater infrastructure practices into common practice. An important paradigm shift that accelerated the mainstreaming process was when DEP updated its stormwater rule in March 2021 to mandate the use of green infrastructure to meet the rule's stormwater management requirements. We do have Michael Sheehan from DEP here today. He'll cover the most recent change to the stormwater rules through the adoption of the Inland Flood Protection Rule, which was adopted in July of last year. There are many co-benefits with green infrastructure that you aren't necessarily going to achieve with just gray infrastructure alone. Mitigating the urban heat island effect, lowering energy costs for buildings with green roofs and other elements, beautifying neighborhoods, just to name a few of those co-benefits. In addition to working with state agencies, other organizations, and local governments, we work with developers to promote and advance the implementation of green infrastructure. Over the past decade or so, we've partnered with NJDEP to convene the Developers Green Infrastructure Task Force, which helps New Jersey's developers and their design professionals learn about, finance, and build green infrastructure. Today, you'll hear more about that, and I just ask that everyone mute themselves. I hear a little bit of background noise. Today, you will hear more about the Developers Green Infrastructure Guide that we put together with the task force a few years back, once the Green Infrastructure Stormwater Rule was effective. We will be updating the guide to reflect the Inland Flood Protection Rule and any future changes. In the meantime, we do have a fact sheet that provides an overview of the Inland Flood Protection Rule and where to find more information. We'll share that link in the chat, and we will share that out again when we send a follow-up email with the webinar recording. Now I'm going to turn it over to Michael Sheehan from DEP, who will cover the Inland Flood Protection Rule update. So take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Lindsey. As Lindsey said, I'm Mike Sheehan. I'm a review engineer with the Bureau of Flood Hazard and Stormwater Engineering in the Division of Watershed Protection and Restoration at NJDEP. It's just a lot of words to say that I review land use applications for compliance with the Flood Hazard Area Control Act rules and the Stormwater Management rules. Next slide, please. So a little background. Back in 2020, Governor Murphy issued an executive order, which was followed up by an administrative order from then Commissioner Catherine McCabe for DEP to start addressing climate change through the development of new regulations and the impacts and threats of climate change. And that became known as New Jersey Protecting Against Climate Threats, or NJPACT. So while we were doing that, unfortunately, the remnants of Tropical Storm Ida did come through and cause significant flooding and damage throughout a large part of the state. And that sort of precipitated us, no pun intended, to really carve out a section of the rules and adopt them quickly to sort of address flooding events from rainfall, not so much sea level rise or coastal processes. So with that, we decided to move forward with what became known as the Inland Flood Protection Rules, and those were adopted on July 17th, 2023. Some of the key changes are listed here. We have the legacy provisions, how projects will be subject to one rule set or another. From the stormwater management end, we have the groundwater recharge standards, water quantity, and how we calculate stormwater runoff. And all of those changes required us to make some updates to our BMP manual. So next slide, please. So going through them, the legacy provisions is really the best place to start because you need to know what rule set you're going to be subject to. So all major developments are subject to the new rules, except in certain circumstances. If no permits were required from NJDEP and an application was made by ordinance, that was required by ordinance to, say, a municipality or a county review agency, and that application was submitted prior to the adoption of the rules, would be legacied, as we call it now. Or if you made an application to the NJDEP and it was technically complete prior to the adoption of the rules, you would then be legacy, provided that application had a stormwater management review component. We do have something like the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act rules, which under general permits, we only look at stormwater if the major development thresholds are triggered within the regulated areas. So we had to make that distinction. It's important to note that we kind of have two tiers of legacy. One being, if the application was submitted between March 2nd of 2021, which was the effective date of the green infrastructure rules. If it was made between March 2nd of 2021 and July 16th of 2023, you would then be subject to the green infrastructure rules. And if it was made prior to March 2nd, 2021, you would then be subject to sort of what we refer to as the old stormwater rules prior to the green infrastructure revisions. We also created a sort of an exemption, and we used to handle this through what we call the linear development waiver, but we felt it prudent to sort of carve out a specific exemption and legacy for public roadway projects conducted by public transportation entities that had reached a preferred alternative or an equivalent milestone before the adoption of the new rules. Public roadway and public transportation entity are now defined terms in the stormwater rules. And we recognize that these types of projects require a lot of time and significant investment and to change them and to subject to them to these rules when they've been going through years of planning and development of the design. We felt it prudent that there was some sort of legacy for them. So if you don't meet any of these sort of legacy provisions, then you would be subject to the new rules. Next slide, please. One thing I forgot to mention, municipalities on the previous slide, municipalities do have 1 year to amend their stormwater control ordinances, but projects that are covered by the residential site improvement standards have to meet the new standards immediately, because the way the stormwater management rules are referenced is a direct citation in the residential site improvement standard. So as they get adopted, it's separate from the municipality stormwater control ordinance. Moving on to the groundwater recharge, not too much has changed. Instead of demonstrating that the increase in runoff volume from pre to post construction for the 2-year storm is infiltrated, we're now looking at the projected 2-year storm. And we'll talk a little bit about what this projected 2-year storm looks like. But otherwise, and the vast majority of projects that we see use the New Jersey groundwater recharge spreadsheet, and that can still be used without any changes. Next slide, please. Water quantity is sort of where the biggest change occurred, at least practically. In terms of rule text, not much has changed. Water quantity reductions must be met now for a total of 6 rainfall conditions. So you're going to have your projected, your current and projected 2, 10, and 100-year rainfall events. So it's important to note that the quantity standards aren't changing, just which events we're looking at. So this would be, the quantity standards are, matching or reducing proposed hydrographs compared to existing, demonstrate that there's no increase in runoff rate, and that the increase in runoff volume or change in timing doesn't make flooding worse. Or what we see most often is your peak rate reductions of 50, 75, and 80% for the 2, 10, and 100-year events. Again, instead of looking at just a 2, 10, and 100-year event as we know them now, there are a current and projected 2, 10, and 100-year event. So that's 6 sets of storms. So how to calculate these is outlined at NJAC 7:8-5.7 C and D. C addresses the current rainfall, and D addresses the projected rainfall. So next slide, please. And so what that looks like is this. First and foremost, we now require the use of NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall data. And then you would take that NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall data and multiply it by an adjustment factor for each county and for each storm event. Essentially, NOAA Atlas 14 was based on data from 1999. And we had we had some studies done through Cornell and the Northeast Regional Climate Center that looked at the increase in rainfall depth from NOAA Atlas 14 compared to what we're seeing today. And then we were undertook another study which evaluated what that looks like projected out to different design horizons. So what we came up were these two tables of adjustment factors based on counties. The projected rainfall adjustment factors are based on 4.5 RCP and the 83rd percentile with a design horizon of 2050 to 2099. So up into 2100. So essentially you take this table here on the left to adjust your NOAA Atlas 14 data to current conditions, which at the time of publication, this was 2019. And then you would take this table on the right to project up to the year 2100 for each storm event. And you can see from NOAA Atlas 14's publishing and their data set to 2019, there's not a huge increase in rainfall, at least in the smaller storm events. Really, you can see about a 15% increase is the maximum during the 100-year storm up in Warren County. But going to the future, we're seeing an upwards of a 50% increase in the 100-year storm depth for something like Sussex County. So we now mandate the use of NOAA Atlas 14 rainfall data, and then applying these adjustment factors to the NOAA Atlas 14 data in order to get your rainfall depths for your different design storms. So next slide, please. So this is a little preview of what's to come a little bit later from some of the other speakers. But when considering this, we looked at sort of how this would impact stormwater design. So we took a forested, undeveloped site up in Sussex County, which had the highest 100-year projected 100-year rainfall increase. And we decided to see what projecting the NOAA Atlas 14 data to the current conditions and to the future conditions would look like. So next slide, please. So if we took that entire site and built it out, what would stormwater features look like? So we came up with this table, and there's a lot of ways to design a basin. So we had some assumptions that we made, and really what we looked at was how much of your land area would you have to dedicate to a stormwater management feature. So at about 2.5 acre drainage area, which is the sort of the maximum size for small scale green infrastructure BMPs, based on NOAA Atlas 14 data, it's anywhere from 8 to 11% of your site being dedicated to stormwater management. And what we saw is projecting it to current conditions, not as much, and projecting it beyond that a little bit more. It's important to note the units here. This is percentages of your site. So if you go to the next slide, we also looked at sort of a residential subdivision, what that would look like, and similar sorts of things, small increases of the percentage of your site being dedicated to stormwater management facilities. But they are significant increases. This is going anywhere from about a 5% increase up to about a 40% increase in basin footprint. So it's not insignificant, but not too terrible, at least in our opinion. Some of the other things, and probably one of the most important things I think is that we adopted was the calculations of stormwater runoff and removing the rational and modified rational method. They sort of oversimplify a complex process. There's a lot of conflicting guidance on what the appropriate values to use are, but we no longer allow the use of rational and modified rational methods to meet your quantity, recharge, or quality obligations. Storm sewer piping is a little bit outside of the scope of the stormwater management rules, and we don't place any restrictions on using the rational method for sizing of conveyance piping. It's typically done sort of with the local soil conservation district. Next slide, please. So with that, a couple updates to the BMP manual. Chapter 5, obviously the calculation of stormwater runoff had to be adjusted because we have these new storm events, and we're removing the rational method. Chapter 6, the groundwater recharge, just minor revisions sort of to reflect the new standard, but Chapter 6 really is detailed about the groundwater recharge spreadsheet, so not much there. And chapters 9.5 and 11.3, which are your MTD designs, those were adjusted to sort of be consistent with sort of time of concentration requirements that are addressed under Chapter 5. And lastly, we did put model municipal stormwater control ordinances in Appendix D to reflect these new rules. So just a quick sort of run through on some of the major updates to Chapter 5, the calculation. Next slide, please. One is the rainfall distribution map. Most of the time we see people using the rainfall distribution map that's delineated by county. And that was put out, I believe, by the New Jersey Department of Agriculture. We say not to use it. NRCS did publish this new map, which shows New Jersey. It's similar to the county delineation, just a little bit different. And really all this distribution and which rainfall distribution, whether it's NOAA type C or NOAA type D, is based on just a ratio of your Atlas 14 rainfall depth during your 25-year storm. So the ratio of your 60-minute to your 24-hour storm during the 25-year event. We don't have sort of any GIS of this shape available yet. We are working on it. We have proof of concept, but we haven't gotten the okay to publish it. So hopefully that'll be forthcoming. The county county map is a good place to start. And if there's any sort of question where you fall in we encourage you to contact us and we can talk it through. Next slide, please. I think one of the bigger changes is the use of the current and projected 2-year rainfall depths for your sheet flow travel time calculations with an increase in rainfall depth that is it's inversely proportional to your travel time based on sort of Manning's kinematic equation here. So an increase in rainfall depth is going to decrease travel time. An increase in rainfall depth is going to decrease travel time. And therefore we're sort of shortening the sheet flow and the time that sheet flow is taking. Did I make sure I said that right? Yeah. And it's important to note that is, you have to use the projected storms and for the water quality event. This one isn't really an update. It's just using and it's something I like to bring up whenever I can. It's just using a shallow concentrated flow equation specific to your pervious land cover. Historically, we see paved versus unpaved, which would fall on the right side of this graph. NRCS says use land cover specific pervious equation. So all this is outlined in Chapter 15 of the National Engineering Handbook. And finally, we just have some useful links here. It's all can be found at dep.nj.gov/stormwater, but the BMP manual is there, and there is a previously recorded training that we did. You can kind of see in the image below you hover your mouse over training and drop down to the Stormwater Management Design Review course. And that all the way at the bottom of that page gives you a good sort of overview of the inland flood protection rules. And with that, that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That was great. Just a reminder to please enter any questions in the chat. Now we're going to hear from Ed Confair, who will provide a brief overview of the developer's guide and cover some case studies. And we'll also hear from Jeromie Lange, who will provide additional background on designing best management practices under the revised stormwater rules and some other important things to keep in mind. So I'll turn it over to Ed.
Thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. So the developer's guide is something that has been around for a number of years now. The most recent update, 2.0, was done back in March of 2021 when the green infrastructure rules came into effect. Next. So the purpose of the guide at the time, and still is to help developers understand and navigate the new rules at the state level as they come online. So it illustrates positive changes to come out of the rules and common practices that have been removed or added, and benefits to be gained, frequently asked questions related to, etc. So there's 8 chapters in the current version of the guide. NJ Future and NJBA will be evaluating if more should or should not come online related to the new inland flood protection rules. But they cover types of green infrastructure, pre-rule change versus post-rule change side by sides, and we'll be giving some updated versions of those during this presentation today. Addressing challenges, solving problems, several case studies where green infrastructure has been implemented, benefits to be gained from green infrastructure, and frequently asked questions, and a resource list of additional reading websites, etc., toolkits to use. And the guide also exists in print and online. Some of you may have picked them up at the Builders Association conference over the years. The online version is the most up to date. It doesn't yet cover the inland flood protection rules. That'll be coming in the future. It does have some information on them, and it does have up to date information on the green infrastructure rules. So the online platform is kind of where you'll see the updates occur most frequently and first before printed versions of the guide follow. And with that, I'll pitch it over to Jeromie.
Thanks, Ed. So Jeromie Lange from Active Acquisitions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means now in real life, so to speak. So as Michael mentioned, you now have 6 design storms. And you might ask yourself, well, why do all 6? Why not just do the new 3 larger, year 2100 storms? The reason for that is the stormwater BMP still need to be able to work for today's rainfall. And if you design for just those larger storms, today's smaller storm events would just sail right through the BMP. There would be a limited amount of attenuation and other types of treatment, so it wouldn't be nearly as effective. The downside of that is by now having to make the basin efficient and effective for 6 different storms, it becomes complicated to do that in a manner that doesn't just blow that basin up, to a large size. So as a developer and a licensed engineer, I kind of now see both sides of this because I'm seeing the cost. If you do just kind of make it simple, just keep growing things, putting fill on the site, yeah, you get the modeling to work very easily, but it really drives the cost up substantially. And I know George Vallone, who's also a developer, is going to be speaking about that a little bit more later on. So in terms of those 6 storms, the first 3 are taking the Atlas 14, which is essentially the 1999 rainfalls, and applying a factor. You can see here, I just summarized on the left, those factors range from 0.99 to 1.15, so relatively minor increase. And then for the larger storms, the year 2100 storms or projected storms, that factor goes from 1.16 to 1.5, which is pretty significant. So to illustrate how significant, Friendship Perla was kind enough to run a 1-acre theoretical site for me just to get some sensitivity of what does this look like in real life. So they ran an acre in 4 different scenarios: a wooded scenario and an A soil, another acre with pervious soils but not necessarily wooded, D soils for pervious land cover, and then impervious. And what they did is they calculated the runoff rates and the volumes for all those scenarios, and then developed some ratios, which are written on the right side. To make this a little more digestible, though, we did some graphics that kind of illustrate the point. So you can see here in the blue, that's the current present rainfall. That's really the 1999 rainfall. And then the orange is the year 2100. So that gives you an idea of the sensitivity. So you can see there's a pretty good jump in both the peak flow rate and the volume. And that has some real implications, both in design and also in just overall conditions analysis, both upstream and downstream of your project site. I'm going to touch about those topics later on in the presentation. So to kind of simplify this, if you look at the really focus on the ratio of peak flow rate. So in other words, on the previous slide, that orange and blue, kind of how they related to one another. This is the ratio. So you can see the biggest impact ratio wise is on a wooded site in, very good soils. And that makes sense because, now you're going to have this increase in volume that's really going to be reflected, where in the other sites, it's less dramatic because you already had a lot of the rainfall being converted to runoff. Where on the pervious sites, the smaller storm events, lower storms, a lot of that's going into the ground. But once you get into these bigger year 2100 storms, that ground's already saturated, and even an A wooded site is starting to act like an impervious surface because you have full saturation of the ground. And that's why you have such a dramatic increase in these ratios. So just to put some numbers to it, in the peak flow rate, you're at about a ratio of 6, and then that goes down to like 2 and 1.3. And then on ratio of runoff volume, it's about a little over 2. It goes down about 1.7, and then about 1.3 for the pervious D and impervious site. So that gives you that kind of ratio. That translates to around an increase in 10 to 30% of BMP size. I know Michael before said the bookends, and this is true, the bookends are probably 5 to 40%, but probably the more center of mass or median is maybe 10 to 30%. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ed. He's going to go into some real world examples now, taking this kind of theoretical stuff and how does this apply to an actual site.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm going to show 3 different sites of varying scales. These are all projects our office worked on over the last couple years since the green infrastructure rules went in 2021. So everything we're showing was designed to meet those standards. They're all major projects. And then we took a look at what the size, both in rate, elevation, depth, and volume of the various BMPs on these 3 projects, what would happen to them under the inland flood protection rules and the factored rainfall data. So next slide. This first site, we're in Morris County, 2.5 acre drainage area. It's just a 4-lot subdivision, single family homes, pretty simple, straightforward scope. So we've got one small scale infiltration basin in the corner of the lot. So maybe not too different from what you would see, maybe even pre all these rules. Small enough site that everything's coming to one location. So this is unfactored data. We're meeting in all 3 examples too. We were trying to meet the 50, 75, 80% reduction thresholds. That was the method of quantity control that we used. So won't read every line here, but we'll have some comparison tables as we go through the slides to highlight the differences. All right, so this was the base design, approved design, got all its local state approvals. So next. So if we were to design this present day with the factored rainfall data, what you see in the blue would be the increase to the basin. So If you look at the table in the upper right, we need about a extra foot of storage depth in the basin. We'd see a little over a 20% increase in the footprint. You'll notice adjacent to it, it's being held by a retaining wall on one side, so that would have to grow a little bit. We didn't update all the grading on these graphics as well. We're really just trying to show comparative, like order of magnitude footprint and depth increases. And the overall storage of the basin would need to increase by about 60% in order to hold all the way up to the factored 100-year rainfall data. So in the precipitation values, you can see some of those increases. So this is just present day, the 99 data, and just the 100-year factor data. We skipped the in between 2019. I think this illustrates the point. So pretty big jumps, especially in the 100-year. But in order to still meet the 50, 75, 80% reductions, which this would do, that's about what we're looking at. Next slide. All right, so this is a little more spread out. Still single family example, but we've got two separate small scale basins here. Also working around on-site septics on this. We're up against a wetland buffer as well. But so this was a fully designed, approved subdivision under the 2021 rules. So next. So just the approved design, 2021 rules. Again, we're using the 50, 75, 80% reduction criteria. Next. So the larger of the two basins, again, the blue shows the footprint. Similarly, the last one, we gained about a foot in depth and over 30% increases in footprint and storage volume. Next slide. Similar in the second one. I'll jump to the next one, has them side by side. Yeah, so if you look at the tables at the bottom, again, and it's important to note in all cases too, and a lot of these sites we're up against, our threshold, our distance we need to maintain from groundwater. So really making them deeper isn't an option. It kind of results in needing to fill. I think Jeromie alluded to that, and he'll return to that point too, that we kind of need to build up these areas to get the extra depth of storage, or we would need to spread out wider than what's shown on these. So far in these two examples, we weren't really space constrained with where the basins were landing, so there would be flexibility to do that without too much impact to the project. And we're, especially in this one, we're not losing any buildable area. There's kind of plenty of room to work these in. But so in both cases, we're gaining about a foot in storage depth, and the increases shown in footprint and overall volume size. Let's go to the next one. All right, so the third one I think is the most interesting. So this is a denser project. We've got 3 different townhome buildings and apartment building. We're right up against some tight boundaries. We've got wetlands to the south, plan bottom of this image. And we've got 3 different styles of BMPs here. So we've got a infiltration chamber system, which we really had no other choice but to locate under the entry drive into the complex. We've got 2 permeable pavement parking areas, which are the bottom center rectangles that you see. And then we had a traditional small scale infiltration basin in the lower right of the project. So next, so the first one, the MTD. The other one I want to point out on this one that was a little unique is the timing of this one. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to get it done before the inland flood protection rules would go into effect. And so the client we worked with on this one made the decision to design it assuming worst case scenario that it might need to comply with those rules. So you'll see here in that first table, the NOAA values, we did go over them. This at the time that I think we started looking at it was our assumptions on what the factored data would be. It doesn't quite match what the is currently in the rule, but so you'll see that reflected on the next slide. So this one's starting point is already a little ahead in kind of assuming worst case scenario. So you're going to see some smaller deltas, but even with us trying to project forward, yeah, you can see here it was still a little undersized for where the rules have landed. But again, not anything that we couldn't accommodate. So here, footprints increasing, but otherwise we're maintaining all our depths. You know, we're locked in kind of at the bottom of this system with groundwater, and really grading on a site as tight as this, you know, we couldn't make the road much higher, so it's just expanding laterally. Next slide. At the bottom, so these are the permeable pavement and the small scale basin. Next. So similarly here, we're kind of locked in with our footprint of the permeable pavement lots. Here we would have enough room, given our separation from groundwater, to make these a little deeper. So here there's no footprint change. It's a depth change of an additional 6 inches. And the small scale basin was actually sized enough that it wouldn't need to change. You can see in the table, there's some minor increase in volume and height, but we actually wouldn't need to make it any deeper or wider. And there's a minor increase in the peak discharge from it, but nothing that affects the percent reductions that we were trying to achieve. Slide. Yeah, so here's the summary. Modest, just under 10% increase in the chamber system, 20% increase in the depth of the permeable pavement storage, and very minor, like 1% increase in the small scale infiltration basin. But so it's proof of concept that the large storm events are still workable on a tight site that's a little bit higher density. And I'll pitch it back to Jeromie here.
Thanks, Ed. So Ed has shown you that you can minimize with proper design approach. You can minimize the impact of these rules, you know, still meet all the appropriate requirements, address climate change without blowing the budget. It does take more work, and there are a lot more factors to consider, though, in doing that. So some of those are on this slide here. With the 6 storms, you definitely added inefficiency to the design, because now you're programming the BMP to be idealized for 6 different events, and it's hard to get one BMP to, you know, be the right fit for 6 different storms. There are ways to do it, but it does take more effort, takes more design time, more thought to get there. And I think, you know, Ed's examples kind of illustrated that. Some other things to think about. A lot of times to get water in the basin, we're relying on storm sewer conveyance. But now we've got to think about, well, what's the design storm? You know, often it's a 25-year design storm. And when you run the hydraulic grade line, a lot of times you can get the 100-year in it. It might be flooded. It might be almost up to the grates, but it'll go through there. That's probably not going to be true for the year 2100, 100-year. It's going to overwhelm that storm sewer system. So flow paths might be different. So you've got to make sure when you're designing a BMP that the water can actually get there, even if it's taking an overland flow path. So that's a really important consideration. Also, the flow paths might be different in different storms. So today's 100-year storm, maybe it all goes through the storm sewer or through a relatively direct path. But in that year 2100 storm, it might be enough where it starts to overflow a high point somewhere and actually starts to flow split. Things like that. So you've really got to pay attention to that, because you could wind up overloading either a different BMP that wasn't intended to take the flow, or sending it off site to an area that it wasn't intended or shouldn't be headed to. Another thing to keep in mind is the downstream stability standards are not changing. So you do have to be very cognizant of discharge velocity limit. The soil erosion sediment control standards are not using these climate change storm events. So you're using today's 2 and 10-year storms to meet stability. But if you do have a critical slope or something like that, just meeting those minimum standards might not be enough, because you don't want to have it. If you get real world erosion, you could have a real world failure of a BMP. It could erode back, undermine a berm, and you could have a complete failure. So even though you might meet the SED standards, that might not be enough. So you really do have to pay attention what's going to happen in these bigger storms and make sure that your BMP is going to survive that kind of event. Finally, the increased volume is going to increase the groundwater mounding. I think you're a couple slides ahead of me now. If you could go back. There we go. The increased volume is going to affect the infiltration groundwater mounding analysis, especially when you're routing the larger storms. So you'll have to pay attention to that as well. So in terms of offsite characteristics, right now, as I just mentioned, proposed infrastructure is usually not designed for these types of storms, and that's even more true in existing infrastructure. Most existing infrastructure isn't even designed for the current 25-year storm, much less future 100-year storms. So you have to think about, where is water going to flow? Might there be unexpected flow paths? The picture on the right here is an instance where water is not only coming down the roadway, but it's actually cutting the corner and coming through yard areas, to get down to this low point here. In some cases, in this case it didn't, it still ultimately wound up at the same place, but it could actually change the drainage area limits. And an illustration of that might be if you had like maybe a shopping center that's got a driveway out into a highway. That driveway might have a high point that's maybe 6 inches above the gutter. And maybe for today's storms, that's enough to keep the water in the highway. It doesn't come on site and head to your BMP. However, in the year 2100 storm, that gutter flow might overwhelm that high point, and now you're actually starting to take water from that highway system into your BMP, which would obviously then dramatically change the design of your storm system. So these are things that you really have to think about, whether it's some kind of overtopping, or if it's a volume-based system. If you're kind of discharging into something that maybe doesn't have overland relief and relies on a storm sewer system or some other means to drain, but that means it's limited, volume might really matter. And you saw before in those ratios, in certain situations in particular, that volume is a dramatic increase, and that may change the behavior of either areas upstream of the site or downstream of the site. And then finally, it might actually impact head of tide, because the fluvial event now, when you run the flood hazard calculations, is going to be much larger. Now that might actually be swinging back the other way when PAC 2.0 comes out, because the tidal flood elevations are also changing dramatically. But for the moment, this could have an impact on where your fluvial versus tidal is the controlling storm. So on the next slide here, I'm going to talk about things to think about in tailwater. So this is the photo of the same area, obviously in two different conditions. On the left side, we've got a more typical condition after a light rainfall. Water is going through this county culvert that you see in the top of the photograph, and that's essentially what would set your tailwater. But in larger storm events, there's an on-site wetland on the upstream side of this road that kind of gets filled up, and then all of a sudden the water now is going over the roadway. So that tailwater now is significantly higher than it would be in smaller storm events. So this difference is very important and more exacerbated in the year 2100 storm. So you've really got to think about these downstream conditions. What are they going to look like in this storm event? Because it could be several feet of tailwater difference, which may then affect your BMP's ability to function properly or as designed in those stormwater. And it's the same with the sister changes in the flood hazard portion of the rules under the inland flood protection rules, that you're now looking at storm event or flood hazard, that's based on those larger events, which again is going to increase that tailwater elevation. So geotechnical becomes even more important than ever. It was always important. That's far more important now, particularly in minimizing the cost impact, right? In many cases, you can make the model work. You just keep bringing in fill, you keep adding more or BMPs, and you can make it work, but it may not work from a cost perspective. And again, being both an engineer and director of development for a developer, I kind of see both sides. So it's important to get the right geotech information so you can optimize that design and you can get results similar to what Ed showed you before, where you can minimize those impacts on the design, which of course translate directly to cost. So along that lines, the DEP did just update Chapter 12 just this month, actually. I just put a quick cheat sheet list here on kind of what was updated, but make sure your geotechnical engineers are aware of the change and that they're reviewing that as they go forward with new work. So continuing on geotech, the approach I found that kind of works the best is to do it in 2 stages. So do an initial like site-wide coverage stage, get an idea of where the groundwater elevation is, what kind of soils you have. And then as you develop your stormwater design, you can go back then and get your final compliance coverage. So in other words, make sure every BMP's got the appropriate amount of testing, whether that's test pits or borings and hydrologic conductivity testing, whatever, seasonal high water table establishment, looking at restrictive horizons. It kind of, by just planning ahead to do it as a 2-stage thing where it's built into your schedule, it's built into your cost model, you're going to get a much more efficient construction design the back end. So even though there's a little bit more cost to go out twice, you will save multiples of that, orders of magnitude of that in actual construction. Speaking of which, doing a boring with continuous sampling will save a ton of money. If you're doing a project that's any larger than like a Wawa, it is well worth the cost of doing a continuous sample boring. Reason for that is the most important, by far and away, factor in the hand-touche model for groundwater mounding is the thickness of the saturated zone, the initial thickness. The continuous sampling boring allows you to exceed what the DEP allows you to assume without testing, which is only 10 feet. You can get that to be multiples thicker, which has a huge impact on groundwater mounding and a direct impact on the cost. It's really the key for counting the benefit of infiltration in your small scale systems. Next slide. All right, so as all of you, or most of you probably know, there are many areas of the state that have poor soils where infiltration is not as easy to do. These might be soils mapped as what we call hydraulic soil group D soils. There might be areas that have conductivity testing that is somewhere between 0.2 and 1 inch per hour. So it's not quite enough to be in the D soil, or at least not mapped that way, but it's enough to be very difficult to design in. So there are options to deal with this. Probably the best way to deal with it is to look at a reclassification of the soils, but for recharge only. It is very onerous to do a full reclassification of the soil group, which we would then use for all hydrologic calculations. But the DEP does allow a more simplistic approach if you're only doing it from a recharge standpoint. That makes a lot of sense. So that's a path. If you have poor soils on the site, such as the 2 I listed here on the top of the slide, reclassification for recharge is definitely worth the time and effort. And you can do it for just portions of the site. So it doesn't have to be site-wide. You can, spot do it. You've just got one area of the site that is problematic. You can go ahead and do the necessary geotechnical work to reclassify that. So what might that look like? This next slide kind of gives you a visual of a site that my firm has worked on, my company rather has worked on. And you can see we had a wide variety of things going on here with different types of soils, some of which we just took the way the web survey has. Others we actually went through the effort of reclassifying. And this took a little bit of time to do, but the net result of the final stormwater design, it was much more efficient than what we would have wound up with. We would have lost, frankly, yield on this. We would have needed more areas for BMPs to meet, what was really a false positive on the amount of recharge. So by going through the reclassification, we were able to right size the recharge to be consistent with what's actually occurring on the site in real life. So even though it took a little bit more engineering and geotech effort, the yield and the construction costs on the back end, again, justify that by multiples. So in terms of modeling of poor soils, when you're doing it, for recharge only, you basically need to show one of these criteria: that the soil is testing less than 0.2 inches per hour, the depth of the restrictive horizon is less than 20 inches, and or the depth of the seasonal high water table is less than 24 inches. When you can show any one of those, then you can treat it as a D soil in the recharge spreadsheet. And again, this can be just for portions of the site. This information is not that difficult to get. It does take a little bit more because you have to define the limits of the area. So it does take a little bit more geotech. And that's again, the beauty or the benefit of doing that two-stage geotech approach, because you can go back then once you've kind of figured out how it's shaping up, you can go back and get the test bits in the right spot to delineate, what is actually happening on the soil. From a design standpoint, what can you do to deal with poor soils? You can look at removing restrictive horizons. That can include soil replacement. Sometimes you have soils that are really bad, and you can do it all the way down to the seasonal high water table if you need to. If you just have an upper layer or some interim layer, you don't have to go down to the seasonal high water table. I will note you do have to test under the soil replacement if you're not extending it all the way down to the seasonal high water table. And that's again where that two-step approach for geotech will help you out, because then you can get that testing if that's the plan. You can use things like underdrained porous pavement or small scale basins. Those are good strategies when you have poor soils or shallow groundwater table. You can also elevate infiltration and bioretention systems on the site. This is the benefit of a treatment train approach, which GI is really pushing you to. You can kind of take water from upper areas of the site or from a roof area and use, take advantage of the elevation if the site is appropriate for that. Key part of the stormwater approach is using small GI. As you'll see on the next slide, small GI is less sensitive to groundwater mounding because it's just a smaller area. Groundwater mounding is kind of peaks in the center of the system. So the smaller and the more linear a BMP is, the less the groundwater mounding is going to come up. This makes sense because, per square foot, if you will, of surface area of the BMP, you've got a lot more cross-sectional area under it for that water to disperse out in all directions. So the more small GI you can use, the better. You'll be able to count the infiltration, which is huge, and even more important with the additional volume coming with the projected storms. You'd be able to count that infiltration, and the groundwater mounding, which is kind of a limiting factor to that, will stay lower when you're in a small scale. Same is true for decentralized. When you put small scale BMPs together, their groundwater mounding interacts. When they're separate, when they're decentralized, spread around the site, they won't interact like that. So what does it look like on a real site? This is a warehouse industrial project my company's working on. And you can see here, we've distributed BMPs all throughout the site. Everything in the green and pink there or purple is a small scale BMP. And you'll see our large scale basins then are significantly smaller than you would normally see. If this was under the old rules, those basins would have been much larger. On a final point here, almost a final point, the manual is very helpful. Even though it's not updated yet for the inland flood rules, it is fully updated as it indicated on the green infrastructures. There's a lot of helpful tips and tricks on how to use or install BMPs throughout the site to take advantage of that. From a technical aspect, kind of how does that look? You could do things like multi-face outlet structures, V notches, more fixed orifices to get those outlet structures really dialed in efficiently for the design. And then a final thought here from a kind of a bonus standpoint, there is a significant change coming to the soil erosion regs where they are going to fully recognize infiltration. So that's a big deal. That should be coming out in the register this spring. Hopefully will become effective maybe year end. So that's something to keep an eye out for.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. Before we move into extended Q&A, I'm going to give George Vallone the mic for a few minutes, who also serves as our co-chair of the Developers Green Infrastructure Task Force, to share his perspective on stormwater management. I'm sorry we're going a little over time, but I hope you all can stick around.
Thanks, Lindsay, and great presentation, everybody else ahead of me here. So just a real quick background on me. I started developing in Hoboken in 1980, buying brownstones for $25,000 and gut rehabbing them into condos. Ergo, the name, not too tricky, Hoboken Brownstone Company. We stayed in Hoboken for 25 years, then moved into Jersey City in 2005. We've been there since, and we're now working also in Bayonne on a opportunity zone development of a large apartment building on a brownfield site. And then my most recent efforts were to purchase some vacant malls. I'm working on one in Flemington right now and one in Voorhees. So I've been involved in the Builders Association since I joined in 1983. I started the business in 1980. My banker convinced me to join the Builders Association in 83. I was chapter president in 86. I've chaired almost every committee there is. I'm a life director, and I was the president of the state association in 2016 and 2017. I had been a regular speaker at New Jersey Futures Redevelopment Conferences, which is the premier redevelopment conference in the state. It's always at the New Brunswick Hyatt. And so I got to know Pete Kasabak, and Pete approached me when I became state president and said, hey, we're thinking about doing a task force on green infrastructure to get ahead of the new green infrastructure rules we believe are coming down from the state. And we'd like to put a task force together to write a guide for developers. I thought it was a great idea. I recruited some folks like Ed and Jeremy and some others from the builder side. Pete backfilled it with a bunch of folks from the environmental policy side. And we've been working together since 2017 on this subject. My takeaways, and I'm going to try to go quickly here because I know it's much more important to get to the questions you guys are interested in than what I happen to think might be interesting, but I'll just speak real quickly about it. I have always tried to deal with my sites in a environmentally sensitive manner. Almost 100% of my work is on brownfield sites. So we're working on cleaning up contaminated historically polluted sites and turning them into mostly mixed use projects with a heavy emphasis on residential component. I like the green infrastructure because it made me think that going to non-structural stormwater systems as opposed to relying on structural systems, one of the benefits was going to be it was going to cost less. And you were going to have a more attractive site because you basically now, instead of building a bunch of structures that cost a lot of money and having to landscape the site, you can now dedicate an additional amount of money for the decrease in structural costs and deploy those into the green infrastructure systems. So you end up with a very attractive site. Maintenance is generally lower because it's landscape maintenance as opposed to basin and pipes maintenance. And in many instances, underground basins and pipes. So there's a cost savings there. I think it gives you a more attractive project. I also think it's the right way to build in an environmentally sensitive way. So that was one of the things. The other thing that I thought I have seen a lower cost of building the systems and maintaining the systems. The one thing I haven't seen yet in a strong way is the opportunity to get more density on the site. That you would, we had thought that having less structural systems would lead to increased density. Haven't seen that yet, but it certainly hasn't decreased density, which is good. So the other thing that I want to point out, and Jeremy highlighted this and Ed highlighted this, is that if you spend more money on engineering up front, you're going to spend less money on construction. And this is analogous to my brownfield experience when we switched to the licensed site remediation professional paradigm. As opposed to DEP case management, I found that the LSRPs were doing much more testing. They were protecting their license by gathering more site investigation, and by doing that and by knowing more about your site, particularly soil remediation, where the more you can delineate vertically and horizontally, the less it's going to cost you to remediate that site. And so the analog here is that the more you hire experienced site designers, engineers like Jeremy and Ed, and you give them the time and the budget to do that extensive amount of analysis, you're going to end up with a cheaper construction cost. I think Jeremy said that the easy way out is to just fill the site up a whole bunch and then carve in your BMPs. But obviously, dirt moving is a hugely expensive part of any project. So you want to minimize that, particularly the importation of dirt. So that was my second takeaway. There's some issues with dry access, which I think is part of this conversation, that I was fortunate enough to listen to Commissioner LaTourette. The commissioner of DEP was a speaker at our builders conference last week. And I mentioned to him that we're having a lot of issues with dry access. And he said that he's heard that. He's had a lot of people applying for waivers. They don't have a process for waivers yet. It's kind of a one-off. Each project gets looked at individually, and he said he's decided to create a stakeholder group just to focus on dry access issues. I offered to join that. He took my card, and if I'm lucky, I may be involved in it, in the stakeholder process. So we hope to see some relief on that front too. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to turn it over to the Q&A. And those of you that can stay for the next half hour, you'll get even more Q&A experience. But as Lindsey said at the beginning of this, the whole thing's recorded. If you have to split now, just pick up the recording and you'll be able to catch up on everything else that's going to happen over the next 30 minutes. Back to you, Lindsey.
Thanks, George. Here's our contact information, and we could put any of these requested emails in the chat if you missed the slide. If you are an engineer seeking continuing education credits, again, a link to a form was provided in the chat, and we could provide it again now. Make sure you complete that because NJBA will distribute certificates of attendance via email, and you must complete the form to receive that. Again, please check out the Developers Green Infrastructure Guide if you haven't already, and sign up for updates for the Mainstreaming Green Infrastructure Program so we can send you all information when we update the guide in accordance with the inland flood rule and any future changes. So we're going to move into some questions. We'll still record this segment like George said, so if you're not able to stick around, if you want to see if your question was answered live, you can check out the recording, and of course feel free to email me. So I'm going to switch screen sharing for a moment so I can help read through some questions that were sent in the chat. So I'm just going to do a quick transition here. Chris Satiro is our new policy and program coordinator. He's going to share his screen. So just give us a second while we switch that over. Okay. Just give me one moment. So I guess since I've been in the background, any speakers, were there any questions that rose to the top for you that you want to address first?
Well, Lindsey, there was a question about like for a large warehouse, which happens to be what we mostly develop here at Active. You wind up with all these BMPs, which is true. So how do you do that efficiently? A couple things. The BMPs, while they have to function independently for their contributory drainage area, which is typically the 2.5 acre limit, you can then send that to a common trunk line to go to the next, typically a large scale BMP downstream. The other thing you can do is you can, so long as they'll function independently for, the water quality storm, for larger storms, you can let them combine. So in other words, if you had a string of small scale BMPs that are kind of, forming a ring around the warehouse, you could allow those to combine in larger storm events and have a continuous water surface in those, events. So that's two kind of tips and tricks for how to efficiently deal with all those basins. And then there was a question on the removal of the case borehole test, and Michael may add more to this, but the simple answer is the method was consistently giving you an order of magnitude off, and it wasn't to the developer or engineer benefit. It was actually under-reporting the hydrologic conductivity rate. There's something wrong with the methodology, and I'd love to get a better answer because it would be great to be able to do testing like that in a boring. We just haven't found a repeatable way yet to do it.
Mike, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, Jeremy pretty much hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, we were just seeing that no matter how good your soils were, you were getting very, very low hydraulic conductivity, and it wasn't being conservative from, existing flow rates, proposed flow rates, and volume. So we made the decision to remove it, and that actually we've been prohibiting it for a while, but the BMP manual was actually just updated this month to address that, to actually formally remove it.
And I see a question just came up on the thickness of the saturated zone, the continuous sampling. No, it doesn't have to be done in the seasonal high water table peak time of year. What you're looking for when you do that is a restrictive horizon. That's why it has to be continuously sampled. A typical boring is only continuously sampled for the first 5 feet. After that, the spoon is pulled back every 5 feet and it's a 2-foot spoon. So you're missing, 3-foot sections of the soil profile every time you pull the pipe back out. By continuous sample, you're pulling it out every 2 feet. So it does get expensive because as you get deeper, you keep having to pull all that pipe out. But it's the only way to get a continuous soil profile. But, again, what you're looking for is a restrictive horizon.
We have already responded to this question. I think, Jeremy, just the beginning. Sorry, I was switching some stuff around, but someone asked how to discourage the design of stormwater basins that try to combine small scale basins into one separated by a berm.
So it actually shooting yourself in the foot to do that because the groundwater mounding from the two will interact with each other, and it's going to give you a false bottom. Well, not false, it would be real in the sense that the mounds will actually interact. You'll get a more efficient design if you can spread those BMPs out throughout the site, because then they won't have anything pushing up that groundwater mounding. So you're going to be able to get more volume infiltrated, and it's just a better design.
Yeah, I can just follow up on that one as well. For us, like Jeremy said, you can have sort of two basins that act independently during sort of the water quality design storm separated by a berm, and then use the area above that effectively as a large scale system. Yes, you can do that, but I also want to caution everyone that the green infrastructure requirements, they are kind of specific in that, you have to be treating water close to the source. So you can't have, two basins next to each other, and that's the extent of it. And then, the whole rest of your site is developed without any sort of stormwater BMPs. You still have to meet that close to the source and the goal of decentralizing your stormwater management systems. We have a document that's listed in the BMP manual that kind of goes through this, maybe not so specifically about sort of hybridizing small scale to large scale, but really how you're meeting your green infrastructure requirements.
Lindsey, can you go to slide 64? Because it kind of it really illustrates the point that Michael just made and that I was making on what it kind of looks like. Yeah, there we go. So where you can put them together is like you see here on the left side. So those are all small scale systems, and they all are together separated by a berm. But when you look at the site overall, you'll see that BMPs are distributed throughout the entire site. So you are meeting that GI, definition where everything's decentralized and they're spread out all over the place. So you can't have it. It's not like a rugby game, right? Where you've got everybody piled together in one little corner of the site where you would, and under the old rules would have had, your kind of just your detention basin in the bottom corner of the site. So that is not permitted. But when you distribute it around the site, you can, especially on like a large warehouse, which is probably the most difficult type of development to do GI with. This is a solid approach.
Okay, great, thank you. There were a few questions about maintenance, like a general question about maintenance costs. And there was another question about reports of poor maintenance of infiltration-based structures, particularly infiltration basins with pervious pavement, causing flooding in adjacent roadways on private sites where HOAs or small retail property owners are the primary responsible parties for maintenance. So, if anyone wants to speak to like costs and then just some general like best practices for proper inspection and maintenance techniques.
I can give you a couple thoughts on that. It starts with good design. A system needs to be resilient. So porous pavement, the pavement itself is really never the controlling factor. It's the soil at the bottom underneath the stone reservoir is where the limiting factor is. Porous pavement itself has tremendous capacity. There's a system actually not far from my office that was installed in 2007. It's the earliest one that I personally designed that has been built. And I'm nearly certain it's never been jetted and vacuumed in its entire life. And there are sections of it that are clogged, but the asphalt still outruns the underlying soil. So we're not getting a failure. Now, can a porous pavement be overrun if your site is not stable, if there's a lot of lawn areas that maybe, the grass isn't well established and you're getting a constant flow of fines into the system, yes, you can overwhelm it in that case. But that goes back to design. As far as other things, they are a little more expensive to maintain, but it's something that an educated landscaper should be able to handle. Again, if you're using the right soil mixes, things like that, it could definitely be done. Another thing I'll caution on, actually, on soil mix, the bioretention media mix in the BMP manual was designed to give a lot of flexibility, but at the same time, you've got to use your head a little bit. You can't be at the max end on the clay spectrum and then put medium sands in on the sand side and think that's going to work. It's not. So you've got to be looking at the overall thing. In a perfect world, it would be uniformly graded coarse sand, right? That's the best thing that can take the most abuse. So you want to be as close to that as you can without killing the vegetation that you're planting in it. That's kind of how you have to think.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on maintenance? There were at least 3 questions that I saw about maintenance, the cost and just the management of basins and other BMPs.
I'll add a little to that too, Lindsay. So I do a lot of work in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia in particular. And Philadelphia has been a little ahead of the game, and the first couple of years, I think, just like we're seeing in New Jersey, right? There's a period where you adapt, maintenance adapts, crews adapt, and there's some failed systems. There's some systems where they don't know the difference between a weed and a perennial. And there's some missteps, and I'm sure it's already happened to those on this call who have maybe implemented some systems. But I think you'll see the maintenance community kind of respond and come up with differences. I think you'll see a lot of benefits of new jobs and areas for employment kind of come out of this that maybe aren't present. And so that'll adapt. I think municipalities in particular will have to, it'll change the way they internally oversee, inspect, and contract for extended maintenance periods. So you can kind of look at some surrounding areas outside the state for some best practices on that as well. And once these systems are in the ground for a couple years and people have gotten used to them, I think you'll see some of the missteps right out of the gate go down, and also the costs associated with it come down too, as people are familiar with the kind of new checklist of steps that they need to kind of perform when they're looking at them.
Great, thank you. And maybe this is a question for you. I mean, anyone can answer, but I think this question that we got during registration about, this is one of your basin sizing studies talked about like site constraints. There was a question about challenges in urban areas where there's 100% building coverage permitted and maybe a green roof isn't feasible. Maybe this is an adaptive reuse of a building that maybe can't handle the weight of a green roof. I don't know if anyone wants to share about site constraints in more urban areas.
Well, I could speak a little bit to that because most of my experience has been in urban areas. When you have a building that covers the entire site, you still have a sidewalk, and you still have generally there's a little planted area between the sidewalk and the curb, and sometimes there's space between the sidewalk and the edge of the building. I have seen that entire perimeter area around the building become stormwater storage with curb inlets and things like that. And then you put the sidewalk back on top of it. So you do have some space when you have an urban site that's not covered by buildings, it's covered by sidewalks. And sometimes aprons, and sometimes driveways, and sometimes other types of things like bike racks and things. So there's an opportunity to use those spaces, underneath those spaces to handle some of this. So I just thought that was relevant.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, George. We've done similar. You're designing linear, basically like trench systems that ring your site as much as possible. The most recent one I've done is in New York, in Newark. Basically the whole perimeter is a trench system. That's the best way to do it. The other option I've seen is, again, space permitting in the building envelope, or sometimes basin is internal cisterns to the building as well. and maybe have some internal reuse options that come out of that approach before you discharge out to the system in the street. So that's another approach I've seen to accommodate as well.
Yep. And when you plant your trees, most city ordinances require trees every so many feet along the sidewalks. And that's also going to help you absorb a lot of that water that's being stored down below there.
I want to highlight this one question and thought that was shared in the chat, and it's something that we've spoken about as a task force with NJBA and New Jersey Future and other partners. Of course, we support effective stormwater management that deals with increased rainfall and other impacts from climate change. But how do we balance effective stormwater management with other community benefits that we want to see, like affordable housing and redevelopment in areas that really need it in New Jersey? So I don't know if anyone wants to share their thoughts on this balance of stormwater management, but the need to still build housing in New Jersey that's facing a housing crisis, affordable housing crisis. If anyone wants to share their thoughts on that. It's a big question, it's a complicated one, but just wanted to make sure that we address that point that was raised.
I can speak a little bit about it. I think a lot of that goes to planning and getting your geotech and everything like that ahead of kind of figuring out your site layout. So you really know what environment you're working in. And then I think like George had said during his part of the presentation is getting creative. There are a lot of options for BMPs. And a lot of these BMPs have the ability to, have extended detention above the BMP. I think, like Ed said, cisterns with a reuse component, especially for housing where you have sort of a gray water demand or a reused water demand, you can really justify using a cistern as a green infrastructure BMP, and then those cisterns can have extended detention above them. Things like that, and just really understanding where you can fit BMPs, where you can infiltrate, where you can detain. If you're running into issues, there's lots of larger scale BMPs that you can use more at the downstream end. Things like constructed wetlands, which don't necessarily have a separation requirement from the seasonal high water table if that becomes an issue. And really a lot of these regulations are trying to guide, not necessarily trying, but it came up in Jeremie's presentation that wooded, good soil site has such a big impact with these new rules. Maybe development there isn't the best idea, or such an intensive development there is the best idea. You can look into, redevelopment sites that have some existing impervious, which give you some flexibility into how much water you can discharge. So it's getting creative, and it's really getting a good handle on the environment that you're trying to put these stormwater management systems in.
Yeah, I would add to that, since I'm a housing guy, I monitor the housing market mostly. I'm also doing a little bit of industrial, but mostly housing. And, in New Jersey, there is such an undersupply of housing, which is why our average cost of housing is one of the highest in the nation. That's a bad thing. But at the same time, putting in new rules like this, I saw several questions that all these new rules are going to cost a lot more money. Well, in terms of competitive advantage, it applies to everybody. So it's not like one project has to do this and then its cost goes so high that the guys that don't have to do it can have a competitive advantage. That's not the case. Everybody has to do it. So if the costs go up, they're going up fairly uniformly across the asset class. And this harkens back to Jeremie's point and Ed's point that if you invest in the engineering up front and you take the time and you let the designers really do their homework, you're going to minimize that cost impact as much as you can. So right now, my production partners that build my housing are telling me, even in today's interest rate environment, they're selling everything they put on the market. That's North Jersey, South Jersey, the entire state has such an undersupply of housing, new housing, and of course, the mortgage rates are restraining existing housing from being put back out on the market, because if somebody's got a 4% mortgage, they're not going to sell their house and then buy something else with a 7% mortgage. They're going to wait till the rates come down. So I see it as a fairly even impact across the state that does not give any one builder any type of a competitive advantage over another.
I had a question about granting waivers or variances. Concern about it's unclear what plans and programs a municipality would have to have in place to be able to grant waivers or variances. So maybe that's a question for you, Mike, if you're able to speak to that.
Sure. We, from the department's end and on the flood hazard and any sort of like CAFRA permitting, if you require a department permit for a department land use permit, we don't recognize any variances and things like that. That would only be at the municipal or county level. The process is intentionally cumbersome to grant a variance, and basically, you know, you need that alternatives analysis to say, hey, we can't fit any of these BMPs in for a number of different reasons, and then beyond that, you have to mitigate, and essentially you have to provide a green infrastructure BMP outside of maybe offsite, which would address essentially the same thing. So you'd be double building. So ideally, you know, the variances aren't really something that should be granted regularly from these rules. And I do know that anytime there is a variance that is granted, and we end up seeing it from one way or another, we forward those to Gabe Mann from the Division of Water Quality, and they evaluate them, because so far what we've seen is that the variances that have been granted haven't really been done in accordance with the rules, and the process is outlined in the stormwater rules. I think it's subchapter, I'm sorry, I think it's subchapter 4 of the stormwater rules. But yes, it is intentionally cumbersome, because in reality, you can fit these in. It might take a little bit more work. It might take more geotechnical investigation. But these are all workable BMPs for just about any site. I do see a lot of questions in the chat about constrained sites and subsurface infiltration. We 100% allow subsurface infiltration basins. There are pre-treatment requirements for them, but yeah, you know, I've seen several subsurface infiltration basins beneath buildings. You know, difficult if you have an existing building that you're trying to renovate, but you know, new construction, we've seen subsurface infiltration basins beneath building footprints.
So we're at 1:28. So just want to give all the speakers an opportunity if there's anything else that you wanted to share before we close out.
Well, I want to pick up just for a second here on Michael's point about variances and waivers and stuff. I understand they're intentionally cumbersome because you don't want everybody to just run in and grab the easy way out. But at the same time, it would be very helpful for us practitioners to know what kinds of variances are being granted. Under the municipal land use law, just to give you an analog, under the municipal land use law, zoning boards which grant variances, planning boards do not. But zoning boards that grant variances have to regularly report what those variances were, and the town uses that when they amend their master plan, so that if there's a consistent issue that constantly comes up and is recognized as valid by a zoning board of adjustment, and they grant the variance, after that happens so many times, they ought to just make that allowed as of right. Whatever the relief is that was being requested by the zoning board, they ought to eliminate that relief requirement and transfer it to the planning board where your as of right projects go. And you use the issuance of variances to inform the decision makers, the policy makers, where the market's going and where municipalities are encouraging the market to go by granting these use variances and other types of relief at the zoning board. So I think it would be helpful for us if the DEP would be able to post the variances that are being granted, or waivers, as you call them, so that, you know, if I'm sitting with Jeromie or Ed and we're designing a building and we run up against a roadblock, let's go check whether or not other people have had a roadblock here and whether or not the DEP saw fit to grant relief. It'll streamline the process. It'll basically allow you to control where the variances being granted are happening. And I probably eliminate a lot of, BS variance requests, because they'll look it up and they'll say, nobody's ever got a variance for this particular fact set that we're thinking might be eligible for a variance. So variances are good because they indicate, what types of changes are necessary. Variances that are granted and waivers that are granted are good because it says, what types of unique situations the DEP recognizes, and that'll help folks like Jeromie and Ed to decide whether it's worth it to even look into something like that very quickly. And in my business, time is money.
George, you got plannered in the chat. Planning boards do grant variances, but C variances. But point taken, because the zoning board, they're the ones who write the annual report to make those recommendations.
Very limited. Planning board gives very limited flexibility. It's the zoning boards of adjustment you have to go to for major changes.
And George, yeah, I'll happily pass that recommendation about publishing them along to the people that run that show. I think it's a good idea.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
All right. Well, with that, I just want to say, New Jersey Future and our partners, we've been advocating for these rule changes. So our stormwater management systems are designed to accommodate increased rainfall for a long time. And now that these rules are adopted, there's been this question of how do these changes play out in real time for new development? So this overview was really helpful for me to better understand, and I hope it was true for other folks that stuck around for this portion. So I want to thank you all again for joining. Thank you to our speakers. Please contact us if you have any additional questions. We'll go through other questions that we may have missed. Maybe we'll put together an FAQ as a result of this session. Again, if you're an engineer, make sure you complete that form if you're seeking credits. And please check out the developer's guide if you haven't already done so. That link is up here on this slide. And again, we'll be sending out. What was that?
I said, and it's free.
And it's free, yes. Take advantage of the free resources when they're available. So again, thank you all so much for taking the time. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. And I'm going to end the Zoom in just a moment.
Great job, team.